Hello, my name is Ranger Mike with the Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site, and this is going to be the third in our series of videos about the Black-owned banks of Jackson Ward. If you haven't, I highly recommend watching the first two videos about the True Reformers Bank and the Mechanic Savings Bank. Throughout this video, we're going to reference them and talk about some of the same things we talked about in those videos. But finally in this video, we get to talk about Maggie L. Walker and her bank, the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank. As a young 8-year-old girl in Richmond, Maggie Walker, then known as Maggie Mitchell, would get her first experience with banking when her stepfather, William Mitchell, would take her to the Freedman Savings Bank, one of the earliest banks designed to help African American citizens after the Civil War. But that wouldn't be her only experience with banks, because living in Richmond made it so she could see the True Reformers Bank and its operations. And so she would observe that bank, learn from it, and take things to her own organization, the Independent Order of St. Luke. Here I am now in Jackson Ward at the 3rd Street Bethel AME Methodist Church. And it's here in 1901 that Maggie L. Walker would have an impassioned plea to the Independent Order of St. Luke to expand their business operations. Just 2 years earlier, she had been elected Grand Right Worthy Secretary of the Independent Order of St. Luke. And she saved that organization from the brink of bankruptcy. But now, she wants to expand their businesses to include a newspaper, a store, and most importantly for us, a bank. She would make special note that as a community, if they brought their nickels together and made them into dollars, the community would be stronger. And her vision would become reality just 2 years later, when the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank would open, with Maggie L. Walker as president, Emmett Burke, who had worked for the True Reformers Bank for a number of years, would serve as the bank's first cashier, and Maggie Walker would pull other Jackson Ward community members to serve on the board of directors, pulling that community together to make it stronger. Here I am now at St. Luke Hall in Jackson Ward, which was the historic headquarters of the Independent Order of St. Luke. This would also be the location of the first day of operations for the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank. In its first day of operation, the bank would receive deposits from 280 different individuals, totaling over $8,000, more than twice the amount that the Mechanic Savings Bank led by John Mitchell would have received. Although it was less than the hoped for $75,000, that didn't deter the bank at all. It continued to thrive, and within just 1 year, they would be able to purchase a new building down on Broad Street and be able to move out of St. Luke Hall. But they had to renovate that building, so in the meantime, they would actually rent a building on Broad Street from John Mitchell Jr. Maggie Walker and John Mitchell Jr. would be always known as friendly rivals, whether it was with their newspapers, their banks, or their organizations as a whole. And they would work together on numerous occasions, such as the discrimination and segregation streetcar protests that they led in 1904. Once the bank moves out of this building, it would thrive down on Broad Street. And within just 1 year, it would have deposits totaling over $170,000, and it would focus its activities on loans for home ownership, to encourage people to be able to buy their own homes and own their own property here in Jackson Ward and Richmond as a whole. The St. Luke Penny Savings Bank would begin to operate here at 112 Broad Street in Richmond, and it would live here for 5 years, expanding and growing in money and success. And while the bank was succeeding here in Richmond, the Independent Order of St. Luke and Maggie Walker wanted to explore the idea of expanding the bank outside of Richmond. And so Maggie Walker would travel up to different areas in the United States, most notably Washington, D.C. and Atlantic City in New Jersey, to explore the idea of opening a branch there. while those were strongholds of the Independent Order of St. Luke, she was never able to actually form a branch in either of those locations. And while they were never able to form another branch, that doesn't diminish the success that this bank had. Because in just 5 years, it expanded so much that not only would they move to another new location, they would in fact be able to build a new building. And the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank would move to location at 1st and Marshall Street in Jackson Ward, where it would live for over 60 years. So here at 1st and Marshall would be that location where the bank would help. And unfortunately, the bank building is no longer here. But we're lucky enough to have some pictures of the bank, which I can show you right here. And this is the bank building that Maggie Walker would spend her time working out of. And she would spend almost 25 years working at that bank, at that location. But when they first moved to this location, the Independent Order of St. Luke and the Penny Savings Bank would have to separate and become two different organizations because bank inspections had started in Virginia. And these bank inspectors would analyze the bank and make sure that it's on solid footing. For the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, that was no problem. The leadership that Maggie Walker had brought to the bank, and the responsible leadership especially, meant that it was on solid footing and that it could carry on. But unfortunately, the bank that opened first in Jackson Ward, the first chartered black-owned bank, the True Reformers Bank, would not fare as well and would be subsequently closed because of dishonest activity and lack of funds inside the bank. That would also be the case for the Nickel Savings Bank, another black-owned bank in the Churchill neighborhood. So at that point, when the bank inspections begin, Richmond would be left with just two black-owned banks. The St. Luke Penny Savings Bank here at this location and the Mechanic Savings Bank run by John Mitchell Jr. Throughout the 1910s, Maggie Walker's leadership would still continue to thrive at this location, and the bank would begin to expand. And while they became separate entities, Maggie Walker would be elected Grand Right Worthy Secretary Treasurer for life for the Independent Order of St. Luke, placing her in that leadership position for the rest of her life. By the end of the decade, and beginning in 1920, two new black-owned banks would pop up in Jackson Ward: the 2nd Street Savings Bank and the Commercial Bank and Trust. When that happens, Maggie Walker calls for a cooperation between the 4 black-owned banks here in Jackson Ward to come together and work together to thrive. While that doesn't happen immediately, those 4 banks begin to all work right here in this neighborhood. And they continue to thrive and expand until the early 1920s, when cracks start to appear. And the Mechanic Savings Bank would unfortunately fail as well. With the failure of the Mechanic Savings Bank in the early 1920s, Jackson Ward would be left with just 3 banks. The St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, of course led by Maggie Walker, the Commercial Bank and Trust, which would have operated down on 2nd Street in Jackson Ward, and also 2nd Street Savings, which is the bank right behind me, led by John Taylor, with Walter Banks as its cashier. But towards the end of the 1920s, the banks of Jackson Ward would start to feel a heavy pressure on them. The economic conditions of the late 1920s turned south, and eventually the banks became desperate. But Maggie Walker rose to the occasion and proposed a merging of the banks. And so in late 1920, 2nd Street Savings Bank and the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank would merge, creating a bigger, stronger bank called Consolidated Bank and Trust. That bank would begin to thrive in the worsening economic conditions. Commercial Bank and Trust was not. But not allowing them to be left out of the fold, Maggie Walker continued to push and got them to join into Consolidated Bank and Trust as well. The three black-owned banks in Jackson Ward would merge. And beginning at the start of 1931, those three banks were now one strong bank that would persist through the Great Depression and continue on. When the new Consolidated Bank and Trust opens, January 2nd, 1931, Maggie Walker would be honored as chairman of the board. Emmett Burke would serve as the first president, and Walter Banks, who had served as the cashier of Second Street Savings, would now be the cashier of Consolidated Bank and Trust. For another 4 years, Maggie Walker would serve on the board before she passes away in 1934. While that happens, the bank can carry on, can follow in her mission to serve the residents of Jackson Ward. Emmett Burke would serve as president for almost 20 years before Walter Banks, at first the cashier, would now serve as the second president of Consolidated Bank and Trust. The bank would carry on after him, in fact, and in 1976 it would move to this location, across the street from the original First and Marshall location. Even though in 2005 the bank is bought by another organization, this location continues to be a bank, continues to serve the residents of Jackson Ward, following in the mission that Maggie Walker first set forth, to serve a community and to bring a community together. And for us here in Jackson Ward, this location still serves in that way.